Luke Harrington, a weary sheriff seeking peace after losing everything, thought he was only checking on a struggling widow and her little girl deep in the Wyoming woods. But ever since that winter storm, his German shepherd, Ranger, had been acting strange, refusing to leave the cabin's edge, staring into the pines as if hearing voices no one else could. Each night, Ranger would growl at the darkness, his eyes fixed on something unseen beyond the snow. One dawn, guided by that instinct, Luke followed him through the frozen wilderness until Ranger stopped at a half-buried trail leading to an old hunter's shack. The padlock was rusted shut, yet fresh smoke rose from the chimney. Someone or something was inside. What secret lay behind that frozen door? Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The wind that swept through the valley of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that evening carried a sound like distant grief, low, endless, and familiar to those who had lived too long in silence. The snow had begun early that year, dusting the pine forest in silver powder and turning the trails into mirrors of ice. Sheriff Luke Harrington, 38, guided his horse through the frozen trees, his breath fogging the air. He was a tall man with a frame built from years of duty and the quiet discipline of someone who had lost more than he could bear. His short brown hair, streaked silver at the temples, caught the dim light of the fading sun. Beneath his dark blue sheriff's jacket and leather gloves, his shoulders looked broader than they were, maybe from the weight of regret rather than strength. 2 years ago, an explosion on a county road had taken his wife, Claire. The fire had left nothing but ash and the echo of her voice on the radio. Luke had been too late. Minutes too late. Since that night, he had buried himself in work and winter patrols, riding further into solitude than any man should. Beside him trotted Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd, once part of the K-9 unit. His fur, thick black and tan, rippled under the weight of snowflakes. His amber eyes were sharp, alert, and too intelligent, as if he too carried the burden of the past. The dog walked close to Luke's horse, his head always turning toward the woods, nostrils flaring for something unseen. Ranger had been pulled half-burned from the same wreck that killed Claire. Since then, he and Luke had become two survivors bound by the same scar. The path wound deeper into the forest, where pine shadows stretched long over the snow. It was there that Luke saw her, a lone woman, sleeves rolled up, dragging a heavy log through the frost. He slowed his horse, watching quietly. The woman couldn't have been more than 30. She was slender but strong, her movements quick and precise, the rhythm of someone used to hard work. Her hair was dark brown and tied back loosely, and her green eyes, fierce and focused, glimmered even in the cold light. Her coat was worn, the wool frayed at the edges, and her boots looked years old, but she moved with purpose. That was Grace Miller. The town had whispered about her for weeks, a widow who had bought a cheap parcel of land deep in the forest to build her own cabin. People in Jackson Hole said she was proud to the point of foolishness, unwilling to ask for help, even when she clearly needed it. Luke had seen plenty of hardship in his life, but never a woman building a cabin by herself in the middle of winter. Near the unfinished cabin, a small campfire flickered, and a little girl sat beside it, her knees drawn to her chest, blowing on a stick to keep the flame alive. She was a fragile thing, maybe 6 years old, with light brown hair falling in messy waves and big brown eyes that carried both curiosity and fear. Her pink sweater was torn at the sleeves, her boots too small, yet she smiled when Ranger approached, clutching a biscuit in her mittened hand. "Can he eat?" she asked softly. "Only if you don't mind sharing," Luke replied, dismounting. The girl laughed as Ranger took the biscuit gently, his tail sweeping snow in slow arcs. Grace straightened, noticing him at last. "Sheriff Harrington," she said, her voice calm but guarded, "if you've come to tell me it's illegal to build here, I've already checked the deed." Luke nodded. "Not here for that, just making sure you and the little one are all right." "We're fine," she said quickly. Her tone wasn't rude, but it carried the hard edge of someone who had been disappointed too often. He looked around, the cabin walls barely up, gaps wide enough for wind to whistle through. "You're doing this alone?" "With her," Grace said, glancing at her daughter. "Her name's Ellie." Luke's gaze softened. "She's got spirit." Grace's jaw tightened. "Spirit doesn't keep you warm." There was something in her voice, exhaustion wrapped around defiance. Luke recognized it instantly. It was the sound of someone who refused to give up, not because she believed she'd win, but because giving up would mean disappearing. He nodded once, then said, "Storm's coming tonight. You'll need to secure that roof." "I will," she replied curtly. That evening, as Luke rode back toward town, snow began to fall heavier, the sky turning the color of slate. He couldn't shake the image of the woman hammering wood in the freezing air or the little girl feeding his dog. When he reached the ridge above the valley, he stopped. Far in the distance, he saw a faint orange glow where Grace's cabin stood, too bright for a fireplace. His chest tightened. "Ranger," he said. The dog barked once, sharp, alert. Within minutes, they were racing back through the storm. Snow slashed at Luke's face, the horse's hooves crunching in rapid rhythm. When they reached the clearing, chaos had taken hold. The wind roared through the unfinished cabin, tearing at the tarp that covered the roof. Grace was clinging to the ropes, her hair plastered to her face, trying to hold the canvas down as Ellie screamed inside. Luke jumped from the saddle. "Let go! You'll get pulled under!" "I can't!" Grace shouted back. "The roof will go!" Ranger darted forward, gripping one of the loose ropes in his teeth, pulling it taut. Luke climbed the frame, the wood slick beneath his gloves, and fastened the tarp back down while Grace struggled beside him. The storm howled, snow blinding them both. The dog barked furiously, his weight anchoring the ropes as Luke drove a final nail into the beam. For hours, they fought against the wind until, finally, the world grew still again. When silence came, it was heavy, like the pause after a scream. Grace fell, to her knees, chest heaving, face pale from cold and exhaustion. Luke offered her his gloved hand. She hesitated, then took it. Her fingers were small, icy, trembling. Behind them, Ellie peeked out from the cabin, clutching Ranger's neck. "He helped, Mama," she said proudly. Grace managed a tired smile. "Yes, he did." Luke looked at her, this fragile, fierce woman standing in a half-built home she refused to abandon, and saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: purpose. "You should come to town," he said quietly. "There's shelter, warmth." She shook her head. "I didn't move out here to be saved. We'll manage." He frowned. "You nearly froze tonight." Grace turned to face him fully, eyes bright with defiance. "I don't need pity from the law." Luke's voice lowered. "It's not pity. It's just that I've seen enough people die in storms." For a moment, they stood in silence, the snow whispering around them. Then Luke nodded once, calling Ranger to heel. "You'll have your roof fixed by morning. Stay close to the fire." Grace watched him leave, her breath rising in small clouds. Ellie tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, is he angry?" "No," Grace murmured, staring at the trail he left behind. "Just lonely." At dawn, light spilled weakly through the clouds. Luke and Ranger were already on the ridge, overlooking the forest. The cabin below looked quiet, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. He felt a strange pull in his chest, something between relief and unease. Ranger sniffed the wind, ears twitching. Then, suddenly, he began to growl. Luke frowned. "What is it, boy?" They rode down again. The snow around the cabin glistened in the pale light, untouched, except for one thing. Around the small house were 3 sets of footprints, distinct and fresh, circling the cabin before vanishing into the pines. Luke dismounted slowly, crouching to examine them. They weren't from him, Grace or Ellie, too large, too deep. He looked up toward the trees, the silence pressing closer. Grace stepped out of the cabin, still wrapped in her gray coat, a faint tremor in her hands. "Morning, Sheriff." "Morning," he said, eyes narrowing. "You told me it was just you and your daughter out here." Grace froze. "That's right." He pointed at the prints. "Then who else has been walking around your cabin?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. Ellie peeked from behind her leg, clutching Ranger's collar. The dog began to growl again, low and steady. Wind stirred the trees, and somewhere deeper in the forest came a faint metallic sound, like iron brushing iron. Grace's face paled. "Probably animals," she said quickly, forcing a smile. Luke didn't answer. The air felt colder than before. He looked back at the tree line, hand resting on his holster. Ranger's fur bristled. The silence stretched, uneasy and thick, until the sheriff finally said, "Animals don't wear boots." The wind howled once more through the forest. Ranger barked sharply, and the faint echo of metal rang again before fading into nothing. Luke's breath caught in his throat as snow began to fall harder. He turned to Grace. "Lock your door tonight." Grace swallowed, nodding. "We will." As Luke mounted his horse, Ranger looked back toward the pines, growling one last time. Somewhere out there, something moved, unseen but close. The sheriff's gaze lingered on the tree line before he finally said under his breath, "We're not alone out here." The snow thickened, swallowing the tracks one by one. The next morning, Jackson Hole lay wrapped in a heavy, white silence, the kind that makes sound itself seem forbidden. The mountains shimmered under the weak winter sun, and the river froze into jagged mirrors of glass. Sheriff Luke Harrington rode out before dawn, his dark coat blending with the pines. The storm had calmed, but his mind hadn't. The footprints from the night before haunted him, the kind of mystery that gnawed at a lawman's instincts. Ranger padded beside him, his paws sinking into the snow, nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The dog's wound from last winter had long healed, but he still limped slightly when tired, a small reminder that even strength carries its scars. Luke reined his horse near Grace's cabin, where the smoke from the chimney rose faintly into the pale sky. The woman was already outside, chopping wood, her movements strong and precise. Grace Miller, wrapped in her gray wool coat and scarf, looked smaller against the wilderness, but there was something indomitable in her bearing. The frost in her hair made her seem carved from winter itself. She paused when she saw Luke approaching, wiping her forehead with the back of her glove. "Back so soon, Sheriff?" she asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, dismounting. "I needed to look at something." Grace watched as he knelt near the tree line where the footprints had been. Overnight, the wind had nearly erased them, but Luke's eyes were trained for details. He brushed away snow and found a faint indentation, a tire track, half buried, the kind used by small farm trucks. "Someone was here after the storm," he muttered. Grace frowned. "Maybe hunters." "Hunters don't circle a house," he said quietly. Ranger barked once, low and sharp, and Luke followed the dog's gaze toward the deeper woods. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of black among the trees, but when he blinked, it was gone. The forest swallowed everything. Grace's daughter Ellie came running from the cabin, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She was wrapped in her torn pink sweater again, clutching a small piece of bread in her mittened hands. "For Ranger!" she said brightly. The dog wagged his tail, taking the bread gently. Grace sighed, a soft smile escaping her guard for a moment. "He's going to get spoiled," she said. Luke smiled faintly. "He's earned it." As the sun climbed, Luke rode back toward town, Ranger trotting beside him. The snow sparkled like broken glass across the valley. When they reached Main Street, the air had changed. Not cold, but tense. People who usually waved now only nodded. Two women outside the post office whispered behind their scarves. "That widow building in the woods," one murmured. "The sheriff's been visiting her every night." The other smirked. "Some folks find comfort where they can." Luke ignored them, though the words pricked, deeper than he'd admit. Inside the general store, Mrs. Nora Whitmore stood behind the counter, stacking canned goods. Nora was 65, slightly plump, with silver hair tied back and eyes that always seemed to see more than she said. Her hands were red from the cold, but her smile was warm. "Morning, Luke," she greeted. "Heard you've been making house calls out in the woods?" He sighed. "You too, Nora?" She chuckled softly. "Relax, I don't listen to gossip. I listen to what's true. That woman's been through enough. You helping her is no sin." Luke's lips twitched into something that almost resembled a smile. "You always were the only sane one here. Don't tell my husband that," she said, handing him a cup of steaming coffee. "He still thinks I married him for his looks." Across town, however, another conversation brewed in darker tones. In an office above the saloon, Clayton Reed leaned against his mahogany desk, gazing out over his land. A man in his mid-40s, tall and broad, with slicked-back brown hair and steel-gray eyes, Clayton carried himself with the confidence of someone who owned half the county, and believed he should own the other half too. His suit was charcoal gray, his boots polished, and his voice smooth but cutting. "She's on my property," he said flatly. A nervous ranch hand beside him shifted his weight. "The deed says it's unclaimed, sir." Clayton turned, his smile thin as paper. "Then find a way to claim it." He lifted a glass of bourbon. "The sheriff's little wood ferry is building on land that used to belong to my father. That makes it personal." By midday, word had reached Grace. She was stacking timber when a stranger rode up, a young man in a thick coat with a note bearing the Reed family seal. She read it silently, her jaw tightening. "They say you've built on private land," Luke said that afternoon when he returned. "You heard?" Grace nodded. "Let him talk. I checked every record before I came here." Luke frowned. "Clayton Reed doesn't care about records. He cares about winning." "Then he'll have to work harder," Grace said, her eyes fierce. Over the next week, Luke came by almost every evening. The excuse was simple: just checking the area. but both of them knew it wasn't duty that drew him there. He helped her cut logs, drove nails, and repaired what the storm had broken. Their silence was companionable, the kind that didn't need filling. The little girl would sit nearby, humming songs her father once sang, while Ranger slept beside her. Grace often glanced toward Luke, her expression unreadable, as if trying to decide whether to trust him or not. One afternoon, while they worked, Grace finally asked, "People in town, what are they saying about us?" Luke didn't look up. "You don't want to know?" "I do," she insisted. He set the hammer down and leaned against the half-built frame, gazing toward the mountains. "They say I have forgotten how to mourn properly." Grace raised an eyebrow. "And me?" "That you never learned how," he said softly. There was a long silence. Then she laughed quietly, the sound brittle but real. "If I worried about every word said about me, I'd never build anything." Luke nodded. "If I feared words, I wouldn't be a sheriff." Meanwhile, Ranger had wandered off into the nearby woods. When he returned, his bark was sharp, insistent. Luke followed him and found what the dog had discovered, small iron traps, half buried under snow. The steel jaws glinted faintly in the fading light. They weren't set for animals, too close to the cabin, too deliberate. Grace's face paled. "Someone's trying to scare us." Luke crouched, inspecting the ground. "Not scare," he muttered. "Warn." He collected the traps and loaded them onto his saddle. These were planted by someone who knew where you live. That night, back in his cabin at the edge of town, Luke sat before the fire, the flames casting restless light across his face. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey but didn't drink it. Instead, he reached for a drawer and pulled out a thin file, burned at the edges, marked with the words, "Harrington, Incident 94B." Inside were photographs, a wrecked patrol car, a collapsed bridge, and the report that had ended his wife's life. His hand trembled as he traced the lines of her name. Ranger lay beside him, head resting on his paws, watching silently. Luke's eyes darkened. "You think this will ever stop?" he asked quietly. The dog lifted his head, amber eyes reflecting the firelight. Luke exhaled slowly. "Didn't think so." He closed the file, slid it back into the drawer, and sat in the silence for a long time. The storm outside had returned, but this one didn't bring snow. It brought wind and whispers, carrying the weight of new rumors and old ghosts. Somewhere deep in the forest, the wind howled against Grace's unfinished cabin, making the windows tremble. Ellie stirred in her sleep while Grace kept watch by the fire. When Ranger's distant bark echoed faintly from town, she felt her heartbeat quicken for reasons she couldn't explain. The next morning, the sheriff's horse stood saddled before his cabin, snow gathering on the brim of his hat. He looked east toward the woods, the file still heavy in his mind, and muttered to himself, "No one's scaring her off this land." Then he mounted and rode into the gray light. The snow came late that week, soft but relentless, blanketing Jackson Hole in a hush that seemed almost sacred. Every roof in town bent under its weight, and the air was so cold it turned breath into ghosts. Sheriff Luke Harrington was back in his office, the heater groaning in the corner, his badge catching the dull morning light. A week had passed since the incident with the traps, and the silence that followed felt heavier than noise. On his desk lay a report from Deputy Sanders, a man in his 20s, clean-shaven, always anxious to please. The deputy stood at attention beside Luke, shifting awkwardly. "Footprints from the Miller property," Sanders said, voice cautious. "Match them with boots worn by some of Clayton Reed's hands. Specifically, a man named Doyle Carter." Luke looked up slowly. Doyle had worked for Reed for years, mean when drunk, meaner when sober. "You're sure?" "Positive," the deputy said. "But, sir, there's a problem. Judge Palmer says there's not enough to issue a warrant. Not without direct evidence linking Reed." Luke exhaled sharply, jaw tightening. The heater clicked. "Let me guess. Clayton made a donation to the courthouse again." Sanders hesitated, then nodded. That evening, Luke saddled his horse. The sun had already dipped below the mountains, staining the snow pink and gold. Ranger trotted beside him, fur catching the light like bronze. Luke's instincts screamed that something was wrong. When he reached the clearing near Grace's cabin, the faint smell of smoke drifted through the trees. Too much for a small fire, not enough for disaster. Grace was outside, kneeling in the snow, clutching her shoulder. Her coat was torn, and blood darkened the wool. Beside her, the neat pile of lumber she'd spent weeks cutting was half gone. Ellie stood by Ranger, crying softly. "He took it, Mama," she sobbed. "The man in the truck." Luke jumped down from his horse and knelt beside Grace. "Who did this?" She grimaced through pain. "Didn't see his face. He broke the door, took most of the wood. I tried to stop him." Luke's eyes flicked to the trail, fresh tire tracks carving deep grooves into the snow. "Stay with Ellie. I'll handle it." "Luke, don't," she started, but he was already gone, Ranger bounding beside him. The trail cut through the forest, weaving between the pines. Luke followed it for nearly an hour, the cold biting into his skin. Ranger's nose stayed low to the ground, his growl deepening as they neared the edge of the ridge. Then, in the distance, headlights flared briefly before disappearing. Luke urged his horse forward, snow flying beneath the hooves. They found the truck abandoned by the tree line. A man stumbled out from behind it, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick coat and a face unshaven enough to suggest carelessness. "Carter," Luke muttered. The man froze at the sound of his name. "Evening, Sheriff," Doyle Carter said, hands half raised. His voice was slurred, his breath heavy with whiskey. He was around 40, with deep lines etched into his sunburned skin and eyes like dull coins. "You out for a stroll?" Luke stepped closer. "You stole lumber from a widow and attacked her." Doyle laughed harshly. "Just collecting what ain't hers. That's for the court to decide." Before Doyle could respond, Luke swung his arm, grabbing him by the collar and forcing him against the truck. "You've got two choices," Luke said coldly. "You tell me who sent you, or you freeze out here while I take your truck to evidence." Doyle smirked. "You think you scare me, Sheriff? Reed owns this town." Luke's fist tightened. For a second, he almost let anger win. But then he saw Ranger watching him, ears back, waiting for command. He shoved Doyle toward the truck. "You're coming with me." By morning, the town was buzzing. Clayton Reed himself came to the station, wrapped in his usual black overcoat, face composed but eyes sharp. "Sheriff," he said smoothly, "I heard you arrested one of my men." Luke didn't rise from his chair. "I did." "For theft?" Clayton asked, stepping closer. "Or for working on private land?" "For assault," Luke said flatly. Clayton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I see. Perhaps you've forgotten how law works here. I can remind you." He turned toward the door, where a messenger waited with an envelope. "Consider this formal notice. Jackson County Board has voted to place you on temporary leave. Excessive use of authority." Luke stood slowly, his height forcing Clayton to tilt his head slightly to meet his gaze. "You think this will stop me?" Clayton's smirk widened. "You're off the force, Sheriff. Without that badge, you're just another man in the snow." By the time Luke returned home, the badge felt heavier than it ever had. He placed it on the table beside his revolver and stared at it until the firelight dulled its shine. Ranger nudged his knee, whining softly. Luke reached down to scratch behind the dog's ear. "Looks like it's just you and me again, boy." The next morning, a knock sounded on his door. When he opened it, Ellie stood there, cheeks red from the cold, Ranger wagging his tail behind her. She held a small roll of bandages and a determined expression. "Mama said you were hurt," she said seriously. Luke crouched down, surprised. "Your mama said that?" Ellie nodded, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She unrolled the bandages with small, careful hands. "She said when people fight for what's right, they always get hurt a little, like Ranger." She pointed at the scar on the dog's leg. "But it gets better." Luke smiled faintly, allowing her to wrap his hand where a cut bled from the night chase. "You're a good nurse," he said. "I'm learning," Ellie replied proudly. Later that evening, Grace arrived at his cabin. She looked different without the tools and timber surrounding her. More fragile, perhaps, or simply tired. Her shoulder was bandaged, her coat freshly mended. She stood awkwardly near the door until Luke gestured her inside. "I came to thank you," she said softly, "and to apologize for snapping at you before." He shook his head. "You don't owe me that." Grace hesitated, then sat by the fire. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Luke stared into the flames. "Every day." "So, why don't you?" "Because I wouldn't know where to go." For a long while, neither spoke. The crackle of the fire filled the silence. Then, quietly, Luke began to talk, not as a sheriff, but as a man. He told her about the explosion, the night the call came in, how he had been 10 minutes away but felt like 10 years. He told her about finding Ranger in the wreckage, how the dog's broken body had been the only heartbeat left. Grace listened, eyes soft but steady. When he finished, she said, "You couldn't save her, Luke, but you can keep the promise to live. The dead don't want us buried with them." He looked at her, the words cutting through him like wind. He nodded once, unable to speak. Outside, snow began to fall again. The world seemed softer, almost forgiving. Ranger lay curled by the fire, breathing steadily. Grace and Luke sat side by side, saying nothing. The warmth of the fire brushed their faces, and for the first time in years, Luke felt something other than guilt. Hours later, after Grace and Ellie had returned home, Luke sat awake, staring at the empty chair across the table. Ranger's head lifted suddenly, ears sharp. The dog's loped growl filled the cabin. Luke followed his gaze toward the window, where darkness pressed against the glass. Far out in the forest, a faint orange flicker broke the night, a small, distant flame. Luke rose, his heart tightening. "Stay," he told Ranger, though the dog's body was already tense. The fire on the horizon shimmered brighter for a moment, before vanishing into the storm. The sheriff stepped outside into the freezing wind, his breath ghosting in the air. The world was silent, except for the distant cry of a raven. Snow fell harder, covering his footprints as quickly as he made them. Somewhere beyond the ridge, danger was stirring again. The fire started just before dawn. The wind coming down from the Tetons carried a smell of smoke and pine tar, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Sheriff Luke Harrington had barely fallen asleep when the knock came, a desperate pounding that made Ranger leap from his spot by the door. When Luke opened it, Nora Whitmore stood there, breathless and pale under her woolen shawl. "Luke, Grace's place. It's burning." He was already pulling on his coat before she finished the sentence. Ranger barked sharply, pacing near the threshold as if he had understood every word. Snow whipped across the valley as Luke rode hard toward the woods, the horizon tinted orange against the silver of the snow. The closer he got, the heavier the air smelled, ash, resin, and destruction. Grace's cabin stood half in ruin. The roof had collapsed on one side, smoke pouring from the gaps, sparks leaping into the pre-dawn gloom. Grace Miller, her face smeared with soot, was dragging a bucket of snow to douse the embers. Her hands were raw and bleeding. Beside her, Ellie, clutching Ranger's fur, cried softly into his coat. Luke jumped off his horse, grabbed another bucket, and joined in, the heat burning his face despite the cold. Together they fought, until the last of the flames hissed into silence. When the light returned, the damage became clear. The cabin was scarred, beams blackened, the small pile of Grace's saved lumber gone again. Luke crouched near the edge of the clearing and found tire marks, faint but fresh, leading toward town. He stood slowly, jaw tight. "Clayton Reed," he muttered. Grace, exhausted, turned to him. "We can't prove it. Not yet." Luke met her gaze. "Then we find a way to make them listen." That same afternoon, word spread through Jackson Hole like fire through dry grass. The town's gossip mill roared to life. Some said Grace had burned her own home for attention. Others claimed Luke was covering for her. By evening, Clayton Reed himself had taken to the saloon to tell his version, a story woven with lies and a touch of charm. "She's not what she says she is," he said to the crowd, his voice low and smooth. "The woman seduced a sheriff, stole from me, and burned her own house when she got caught." Men who owed him favors nodded along, eager to please their benefactor, but not everyone believed. Nora Whitmore stood from her table and fixed him with a glare. "You've got a tongue slicker than oil, Clayton," she said, her voice sharp as a whip. "But you forget, oil burns too." The room went silent as she walked out, her cane tapping the wooden floor like a gavel. That night, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She filed a claim of arson and property theft against Clayton Reed himself. It was madness, everyone said. No one went against Reed and won. But Grace's eyes were steady when she said to Luke, "He took everything from me. If I let him keep it, I'll have nothing left but fear." The trial was scheduled 3 days later in the town's community hall, a place that hadn't seen this much excitement since the last winter fair. By morning, the hall overflowed with townsfolk. Snowmelt dripped from boots, the air thick with whispers. At the front sat Judge Palmer, a balding man in his late 50s, with narrow spectacles and a mustache that quivered whenever he was nervous, which was often. Clayton entered with 2 lawyers, his black coat immaculate, his smile polite and poisonous. Grace followed soon after, her gray coat mended again, her hair neatly tied back. Despite her exhaustion, there was fire in her green eyes. Ellie sat beside Nora Whitmore, holding a worn teddy bear against her chest. Ranger lay at her feet, calm but watchful, a bandage still visible where the last skirmish had left a scar. Luke stood in the back of the hall, his badge still resting in his pocket, no longer pinned to his chest. The proceedings began with Clayton's attorney, Frank Dillard, a man with slick blonde hair and a grin too wide for his narrow face. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this woman seeks to tarnish the reputation of an honorable landowner. She has no deed, no credibility, and," he glanced toward Luke, "no sense of decency, as she's been living under improper protection from the sheriff himself." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Grace's hands trembled slightly, but she lifted her chin. "Everything I've built was on land I purchased fair and legal," she said firmly. "The documents were filed at the county office, which mysteriously burned down the same week Clayton's men started trespassing." Gasps echoed. Judge Palmer cleared his throat. "Sheriff Harrington, you've been involved in this matter?" Luke stepped forward slowly. The crowd's eyes followed him like shadows. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the badge, and set it gently on the table before the judge. "Not as sheriff," he said quietly, "as a man who's seen too many people lose their homes to fear." His voice grew louder, echoing through the wooden hall. "If helping an innocent woman makes me guilty of crossing the line, then maybe it's time I start over, as a human being, not as a title." The room fell utterly silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Then, from somewhere in the back, Nora's voice rang clear. About time someone said it. Grace's lawyer, a modest young man named Aaron Beckett, short, spectacled, barely 30, rose nervously to present evidence. Fragments of tires, boot prints, and a half-burned letter with Clayton's company seal found near the wreckage. His voice trembled at first, but steadied as he spoke. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Clayton's smile had thinned. When the judge adjourned for deliberation, whispers filled the hall again. Outside, the sky was bruising purple, the snow falling heavier. Grace stood beside Luke by the porch. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yeah," he replied, glancing at the crowd that avoided meeting his eyes. "I did." That night, the storm returned. The wind howled across the valley like an old wound reopened. Luke had just finished patching the cabin's door when Ranger froze, his ears pricking toward the tree line. A second later, he barked, a deep warning bark that made Luke's blood run cold. "Grace!" Luke shouted. She turned from the hearth just as a flash of movement broke through the darkness. 3 figures, dressed in black, sprinting through the snow toward the cabin. Ranger lunged first, teeth bared, barking furiously. Grace grabbed Ellie and pulled her behind a fallen beam. As one of the attackers raised a pistol, a gunshot split the air. Ranger leaped, slamming into the man's arm, the shot veering into the ground. The second man swung a crowbar, hitting Ranger in the shoulder, but the dog didn't fall. He clamped his jaws harder, forcing the attacker down. Luke fired once into the air, and the men scattered into the trees, dragging one of their wounded with them. Ranger staggered, blood staining the snow. Ellie screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "No, no, please don't," she cried, clutching his fur. Grace knelt too, her face streaked with tears. "He saved us," she whispered, voice shaking. "He saved us." Luke crouched beside them, pressing his hand against Ranger's wound, his own eyes glistening in the firelight. "Stay with us, boy," he murmured. By dawn, the attackers had been caught, Clayton among them. His expensive coat was torn, his face pale with fury and disbelief. "You can't prove anything," he shouted as Luke handcuffed him. "You think this town will believe a woman and a washed-up sheriff over me?" Luke looked at him, voice calm. "They already do." 2 days later, Ranger lay at the small veterinary clinic in town. Ellie sat beside him, clutching her teddy bear. She placed it gently under his paw. "He doesn't get scared at night," she whispered. "So, you won't either, okay?" Ranger blinked slowly, tail thumping once against the blanket. Outside, the townsfolk gathered near the square. Nora Whitmore stood before them, her gray scarf fluttering in the wind. "When justice covers her eyes," she said, voice steady, "we become her eyes. And we've seen enough." Heads nodded, murmurs of agreement rising. For the first time in years, Jackson Hole felt something rare, hope. The snow kept falling, but it no longer felt cold. The snow began to melt in slow surrender, revealing the brown earth beneath, soft and wet, with the first hints of spring. The valley around Jackson Hole was no longer a cage of frost, but a cradle for renewal. Smoke no longer meant destruction here. It meant warmth, coffee, and morning bread. After weeks of investigation, the state police delivered their final report. Clayton Reed was found guilty of falsifying land deeds, arson, and conspiracy. His empire, built on fear and silence, crumbled overnight. The man who once walked through town like a king was led away in chains, his eyes hollow, his expensive suit smeared with the dirt he thought he'd never touch. The news spread fast. People who once whispered behind Grace Miller's back now came forward with awkward apologies. Jackson Hole, a town that had thrived on rumor, seemed to collectively decide it had had enough of its own shame. And on the first Sunday after the verdict, when the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks, Nora Whitmore stood outside her shop, hands on her hips, and declared to anyone within earshot, "We're rebuilding that woman's home, all of us." By noon, a dozen townsfolk had gathered in the clearing where the charred remains of Grace's cabin stood. The snow was still deep in places, but the sound of hammers and saws soon drowned out the winter silence. Grace, her hair pulled back in a braid, her face still marked by faint scars from the fire, worked beside them tirelessly. She wore an old denim jacket and gloves too large for her hands, her breath steady, her eyes alight with something fierce and beautiful, purpose. She had always been slender, with quiet strength hidden behind gentleness, but now she carried herself like someone who had walked through fire and refused to bow. Ellie darted between the workers, her pink coat patched and muddy, but her laughter bright. Ranger followed at her heels, his bandaged shoulder healing well, tail wagging every time someone called his name. The dog's fur gleamed under the sunlight, a mix of black and tan, and his amber eyes watched everything with the calm patience of a guardian who had finally found peace. Luke Harrington arrived later that morning, no longer in civilian clothes but in his full sheriff's uniform. The silver badge on his chest caught the sunlight, though now it seemed less a symbol of power than of redemption. The townspeople greeted him with nods, some with handshakes, even a few with embarrassed smiles. He had been reinstated by the state police after the trial, not because of his rank, but because of his integrity. Luke had changed, and everyone could see it. The man who once hid behind duty now carried something gentler in his gaze. Grace looked up from the beam she was measuring as he approached. "Back in uniform?" she asked, teasing lightly. He shrugged. "They said the county needs someone honest for a change." Her lips curved. "Then I guess they picked the right man." For 3 days the rebuilding continued. The cabin rose from its ashes slowly, beam by beam, nail by nail. Nora Whitmore, wrapped in her thick gray scarf, oversaw the efforts like a general, handing out mugs of cocoa and sandwiches. "You there! Don't just stand around staring at her, Luke," she called at one point, smirking. "Pick up that hammer!" The crowd burst into laughter, and even Luke couldn't help but grin. Reverend Samuel Price, a gentleman in his 60s, with thinning white hair and a voice like warm honey, came by each afternoon to pray with the workers. He had been the town's minister for nearly 4 decades, the kind of man who believed more in kindness than sermons. "You see," he said to Luke, as they stood watching Grace paint the new window frames, "sometimes God rebuilds people by giving them something to rebuild." The third evening brought a quiet celebration. The townsfolk gathered in the newly finished cabin, its interior glowing with the soft light of kerosene lamps. The smell of fresh wood mingled with cinnamon and warm bread. Nora had organized everything: long tables laden with food, a small fire crackling in the hearth, and a worn phonograph playing old folk tunes. People who had once turned their backs on Grace now offered gifts: a handmade quilt, a loaf of bread, a set of carved wooden chairs. Ellie ran to Luke, holding up a small pot of soil. "Mama said I could plant these," she announced proudly. Inside were tiny seeds. "They're Daddy's flowers. He kept them before he went away." Her voice faltered slightly. Grace joined her, kneeling beside the girl. "He used to say these wildflowers only bloom where there's light," she said softly. Luke crouched down too, helping Ellie dig a small patch of earth by the window. Ranger sat beside them, nose twitching curiously. "Then let's give them the best light we've got," Luke said. When the ceremony ended, the townsfolk began to leave one by one, their laughter fading into the cold night. Only Luke, Grace, Ellie, and Ranger remained by the cabin door. The sky above them glowed deep orange, the mountains wrapped in twilight. Grace looked out at the horizon, her breath visible in the cooling air. "I built this house with my own hands," she said quietly. "But you," she turned to Luke, her eyes glistening, "you helped me build something I thought I'd lost forever." Luke's voice was steady but soft. "What's that?" "My heart," she whispered. He smiled faintly, his hazel eyes catching the firelight. "You reminded me that justice doesn't live in a courtroom. It lives right here." He placed a hand gently over his chest, then over hers. From behind them came Ellie's laughter. "Now our house is really complete," she cried, hugging Ranger, who barked happily, tail sweeping the floor. The sound made both adults turn and smile, the moment light and human. Grace brushed a tear from her cheek. Luke reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows of the new cabin. The air smelled of pine and earth instead of ash. Luke stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching as Ellie and Ranger played in the yard. Grace joined him, her hair loose for once, golden in the early light. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Later, as the day faded, Nora returned with flowers and a basket of bread. "I thought you might like some color," she said, placing the bouquet on the table. "You folks gave this town something it hasn't had in years, hope." Luke thanked her quietly. As she left, the old woman looked back and said, "And Sheriff, don't break that woman's heart. She's stronger than all of us, but even stone can crack." That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, the family, because that's what they had become, stood together on the porch. The light of dusk bathed their faces in gold. Ellie leaned against Grace's leg, clutching Ranger's collar. The dog looked up at Luke, then toward the valley below, where the snow had begun to melt into glittering streams. For a long moment, none of them moved. The air was still, filled only with the distant murmur of birds returning home. Then, slowly, the camera of the world seemed to pull back, showing the small wooden cabin nestled between the whispering pines, smoke rising gently from its chimney into the blue of the evening sky. In the background, a child's laughter echoed, blending with Ranger's bark and the soft creak of the porch. And then, a narrator's voice, steady, warm, and full of quiet truth, seemed to rise above it all. "A house is not built of wood alone, but of courage, forgiveness, and love. For even the most broken hearts can learn to shine again when given light. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not thunder or lightning from the heavens, but the quiet rebirth of a heart that dares to hope again." Grace lost her home, her safety, and her faith in people, but through courage, kindness, and love, she found that God never left her side. He simply worked through those who chose compassion over judgment. Luke's redemption, Ellie's laughter, and Ranger's loyalty remind us that even in our darkest winters, God plants the first seed of spring within us. This story teaches us that miracles often begin with a single act of goodness, a single heart choosing to forgive. No matter how broken we feel, the Lord can rebuild what was lost, if only we open the door for His light to enter. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what miracle you are praying for in your life. And if you believe that God can turn pain into purpose, type Amen in the comments. May the Lord bless you, your family, and all who carry kindness in their hearts. Subscribe to our channel to keep faith and love alive in every story we tell. Amen.